Amen. In 2006, in Arizona, there was a cyclist who was run over by a Camaro, and he actually got trapped beneath the wheels. Now, a man by the name of Tom Boyle Jr., he saw what happened, and he went over, and with a rush of adrenaline, he lifted the Camaro up, the front two wheels, up off the young man, and they pulled the cyclist free. It's kind of a familiar story, right? You know, an adrenaline rush lets someone do something incredible, lets a human do impossible things to save someone. And there's actually a lot of stories like this, you know, with young mothers lifting cars off of their children and friends lifting garage doors off of young animals. And, you know, and the explanation is always the same. An adrenaline rush allows you to do incredible things. But the unique piece about Tom Boyle of Arizona with the Camaro and the cyclist is that Tom Boyle was a weightlifter. He was very well aware of his own physical limitations. Now, there was a guy. His name was Vladimir Setsortsky. I hope I'm saying that right. He was a biomechanics specialist at Penn State. And he came up with a formula for something that he calls the absolute strength of a human being. The absolute strength is the theoretical maximum that your muscle fibers, tendons, and bones can take. Regardless of the adrenaline going through your system, there is a limit on what your bones are physically capable of handling. And so Tom Boyle Jr., he was a weightlifter who could, on his best day, his best documented lift, where he could lift about 700 pounds. Now, with an infusion of adrenaline and the pressure of the moment, Vladimir Setsortsky calculated that Tom's maximum strength was roughly 875 pounds, way beyond his best day, 875 pounds. But Tom's muscles couldn't handle much more than that. The world record for weightlifting is 1,003 pounds. That's a lot. But here's the thing. The article I was reading from Skeptoid.com stated no matter what inspiration, mental mode, or adrenaline rush came over him, lifting much more than that would have resulted in structural failure. And the car would have fallen and crushed the young cyclist. 875 pounds was about what Tom Boyle could handle. But here's the thing. The effort required to lift the front two wheels off a Camaro is 3,000 pounds. It was impossible. And yet there is a man alive today because of what Tom Boyle did. 3,000 pounds, more than triple what the biomechanics specialist calculated was physically possible for his muscle fibers. It was truly impossible. Today, we are starting a brand new sermon series. For the whole month of May, we're going to be digging into the story of King David in the Old Testament. We're going to be looking at all the different stories that come with his life. Now, I feel like most of us probably know the story of David and Goliath, right? I mean, even non-Christians or folk who haven't been in a church in decades, you know, everybody's kind of heard of David and Goliath. The small shepherd boy takes down a giant. It's a pretty familiar story. It's one of the greatest underdog metaphors ever written. But let's back up a little bit to see why David and Goliath is such a big deal. You see, at this time in history, in the ancient world, most cities and nations had their own gods. Every town, every area had their own deity, had their own god. And the power of that god was demonstrated through victory in battle. And so soldiers didn't win battles in the Old Testament world. Kings didn't win battles in the Old Testament world. Gods won battles. You know, this is how they understood the world. It wasn't about the human beating the human enemy. It was about my God can beat up your God. Like that's how they understood their conflicts. Leaders would take their armies into ridiculous situations if they felt like their God was stronger than their enemy's God. I mean, the Old Testament story is full of stories of underdog armies supported by God defeating much bigger, stronger, better trained armies. And so in our story, the battle lines are drawn and Goliath comes out, and then they spend a lot of time describing what Goliath looks like. They say he was 6 cubits tall. If you look in your little footnotes down at the bottom, it says he was 9 feet and 9 inches tall. That's how big Goliath, 9.5 feet, 9 3/4 feet. That's a big guy, you know? And then they talk about how huge his spear is and how heavy his shield is, and they spend all this time describing this giant man. And he comes up in verse 10 and he says, and the Philistines said, "Today I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all of Israel heard the words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now you got to remember, this is not about an Israelite fighting a 9-foot man. This is about my God versus your God. So Israel's fear is not just about this big giant person in front of them. It's about the lack of confidence that they have in God, a vote of no confidence in God. You see, King Saul, he was the very first king of all of Israel, and he had a habit of running away. He had a habit of when things got tough, he would doubt God. He would run away and find some other solution. And then we introduce David. David is the runt of the family. He is the youngest, smallest, weakest brother. And so he wasn't even allowed to go to the battle. He's too small for that. He got to tend the sheep at home. He wasn't even allowed to go to the camp. But then his father, Jesse, told him, all right, you got to go and bring food to your brothers, to the real soldiers, right? You got to bring food and provisions for your brothers who are doing the fighting. And it says in verse 20, David rose early in the morning, and he left the sheep with the keeper. And he took the provisions, and he went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the army was going forth to the battle, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, an army against army. And David left things in charge of the keeper of the baggage, and he ran to the ranks, and he went and greeted his brothers. And as he talked with them, the champion Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistine and spoke the same words as before. And David heard him. Okay, David is not even supposed to be there. It's a complete coincidence, if you believe in that kind of thing, that David is even in the room, right? He's not supposed to hear about this, but he's there. And so he hears these words, and it goes on, and it says, and all of the Israelites, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were very much afraid. And the Israelites said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. The king will greatly enrich the man who kills him, and will give him his daughter and make his family free in Israel. David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he would defy the armies of the living God? And so David just happens to be in the room to hear Goliath shout his challenge, and I love his response. He says, who is this guy? Who is this person who is just astounded that Goliath would say this stuff and get away with it unchallenged? He says, who is this guy who would defy the armies of the living God? But that's the second thing I want to point out to you. He says the armies of the living God. Israel is not King Saul's army, right? These are the armies of the living God. David understands this is God's battle. But that's one of the fundamental assumptions of this text. It's God's battle. David is completely unconcerned that the man is over 9 feet tall and has no idea how he's going to kill the man. He's just not worried. Now here's the parallel. Life is God's battle. Let me say that again. Life, everything we do, everything we are, every struggle we face is God's battle. God will fight for us if we can trust him to do it. And so then David, he goes before Saul and he says, all right, I'll do it. I will fight the giant. One-on-one combat, I will face the giant. And in verse 37 he says, so Saul said to David, go, and may the Lord be with you. And Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped on Saul's sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to walk, for he was not used to them. And then David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I'm not used to them. So David removed them. And then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the Wadi, which was a river nearby, and he put them in his shepherd's bag in the pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. So instead of Saul's armor, David is going up against the Philistine with a couple of rocks in his man purse. And he takes on the Philistine. And so Saul tries to outfit David in his armor. He's like, you're facing a giant. You got to use my armor. You got to use my solution. But here's the thing. Facing the giants in our lives is a unique adventure. It's different for each of us. One man's solution is not going to apply to our lives. There's no cookie-cutter solutions in life. I hear a lot of people, pastors that I talk to or other congregations and stuff, they'll start conversations and they'll say things like, well, you know what the one thing the church needs to do is? Or they'll say, you know what, with the one program that we need to have that will solve all of our problems, as if there was just one solution that would fix all our problems here in the church. But here's the thing. There are thousands of problems in life, and they take thousands of answers, thousands of responses. Anytime somebody starts talking like they got the silver bullet, like they got that one program and that one thing that you need that's going to solve all your problems, you should maybe stop listening to them. Because church life, just like regular life, is complicated. It takes hard work, and there are lots of different answers. Yeah, listen to each other, learn from each other, but every adventure is going to be unique. David could not have beaten Goliath wearing Saul's armor. Okay, he would have died. David came at Goliath from a different angle, from one that no one else had thought, and he defeated the giant. Now, I'm going to tell you a story in just a second, and you've probably heard something like this story, but I think it really illustrates the point. There once was a man who lived in a valley, and a storm was coming, and it was going to rain and flood the valley. And so the news crews let everybody know, when they evacuated the valley, you got to move out, you got to get out. And this man said, nope, I will just pray to God, and God will save me. And so the rains began, and the water rose up to his window, and a woman comes by in a canoe, and she says, hop on in, I'll take you to safety. And he says, nope, I will pray to God, and God will save me. So the rains continued to fall, and the water rose a little higher, so the man moved to the second floor. And a rescue worker came in a boat and said, come on, hop in my boat, I'll save you. We'll go to safety. The man said, nope, I will just pray to God, and God will save me. And then he went back to praying. And the rains continued to fall, and the water came even higher, and so the man moved up onto his roof. And they came after him with a helicopter, and they lowered down a rope, and they said, grab the rope, climb on up, we'll pull you to safety. And the man said, nope, I will pray to God, and God will save me. And then he went back to praying. As you can imagine, the man died. Then he goes up to heaven, and he turns to God, and he says, God, what was that? I prayed so hard. Why didn't you save me? And God looks at him and says, I sent 2 boats and a helicopter. What more did you want? First thing we realize is that God will fight for us, because our life is God's battle. Yes, but I want to be careful with that. Because the second thing we realize is that God's not going to open up the heavens and solve all our problems for us. That's not how it works. He likes to work in surprising methods. David, the shepherd boy, was a surprising method. No one, literally no one, thought that he could do it. Not his brothers, not the prophet Samuel, not the king, not even his own father. And yet David approaches the Philistine in verse 45. And he says, but he said to the Philistine, you come at me with a sword and spear and javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This very day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head. And I will give the dead body of the Philistine army this day to the birds of the air and the wild animals of the earth, so that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. David's trash talk is on point. He knows how to scare you, right? Like, that's some intense language he's using. And it would have been impossible for David to defeat this giant. It was impossible for him to defeat Goliath. He couldn't do it, but God could. And God did. Not by stepping in and doing everything for us, but by using an unexpected underdog method. See, the good news this morning is that God fights for us. In the moments of our lives when we are facing a giant, when we are facing an impossible obstacle, we cannot do it. And you're right, we can't. But God can. He fights for us, and he loves to use the unexpected underdog methods to get it done. And so the question we have now is, what are our giants? What are we struggling with in our life? What are the things in life that are shouting down at you, telling you that you can't get it done? We each have our own unique struggles. Maybe for you it's stuff in your spiritual development. Maybe it's tithing, like the giant of money troubles. Maybe when you're putting your budget together, it's just impossible to make space for God in there. Or maybe it's your prayer life, your devotion time. Maybe when you're putting your schedule together, it's just impossible for you to carve out some time to pray for other people. Another personal giant is reading your Bible every day. I hope all of you read your Bible every single day. It is so important to the Christian life. But the Bible's hard to understand. It can be really boring and confusing, and come on, every day. It's just impossible. Those are kind of the lighthearted ones. Other giants are a little bit more devastating in how they affect the people around us. The giants of addiction. struggles with honesty, struggles with adultery, anger, hate, lust. Here's one we like to ignore: the giant of gossip and the way we talk about each other. When we don't know how to handle something or we're embarrassed about it, we just ignore it. We leave it in the corner and we hope that it goes away, but the giants in our lives feed on fear. They are like rot or mold. If you ignore them, they will grow and grow and grow. Okay, so think about this. If you notice ants in your kitchen, do you give up? Oh man, there's ants. I guess we're going to have to move. Just pack up the food. We can't live here anymore. They win. Of course not. You're going to clean up the ants. You're going to deal with the problem, right? It's the same in your life. I mean, can you imagine if the Israelites, they draw out for the battle lines and they're like, well, there's just nothing we can do. He's just going to say mean things at us every day for the rest of our lives. No, that was their plan. Literally, that's what they were doing. But King David comes in. Now you might be thinking, Pastor JJ, my personal giants are a lot bigger than ants in the kitchen. And I get that. Some issues in life are more difficult than others, but you got to remember who's in charge. You got to remember who is doing the fighting, whose battle it is, and then the problems level out. I don't care if your sins, your struggles, your giants are teeny tiny or enormous. God can handle them. And you might be thinking, Pastor JJ, my giants are impossible. I cannot overcome them. I cannot beat them. You're right. That's great. You've realized the first step is to admit that you can't do it by yourself. The first step to overcoming your giants is to realize that you cannot do it alone. But I'm here this morning to tell you that you are not alone. And the God who fights for you, in his vocabulary, impossible is not even a word. Step one, you got to realize how big those giants are. The second piece is you got to admit your struggles. I think more problems come in church from embarrassment than anything else. This is supposed to be a place of invitation, a place of mercy and grace, and yet we've got people afraid to admit that they're even struggling. Now, there's two sides to this. Number one, we got to be open to admitting our struggles. But the second part is we got to create a space where people feel safe to admit their struggles. All right, I've been your pastor for a little while now, and I have started to get to know the stories of your lives. People come to me and they tell me what they're going through. And if I had one message for all of you, it's you are not alone. All right, I would never betray confidence. I'm not going to tell what your secrets are, but I know that y'all are dealing with the same things as you guys, and you're over here, and you need to meet you. And I'm not actually pointing at real people, but you know what I mean, right? You understand where I'm coming from, though, right? I have seen the deeper level beyond what we do on Sunday morning, and none of you are alone. We go through these things together, but we're so embarrassed to talk about it in this place because we're too busy putting on a face. Nobody can improve if they're all afraid to admit that they have struggles. Recognize how big your giants are, admit your struggles, and then the last piece is you got to face your giants. Actually do something to combat them. It's not enough just to be able to list your weaknesses. You got to actually face them and tear them down. Beyond our personal struggles, there are things that we as a group have built up into giants. And one of the biggest giants I believe we face as a church is the giant of assumptions. See, there are things in our lives that we simply accept with a shrug. Nothing we can do about it. I guess I'll just listen to Goliath yell at me over and over every day and do nothing about it. For example, the divorce rate in America has hovered around 50% for the last couple of years, right? But when we talk about it, we don't say that. We don't say that statistics show that 50% of marriages struggle. No, we say it like it's a statement of fact. 50% of marriages fail. And as if there's nothing that we can do about it, but I say baloney. All right, this is my big, deep theological concept for you today, okay? Baloney. I say that is a giant that we have let taunt us for far too long. Like David and Goliath, we need to say, who is this guy? He's got to go. He's got to go. Are we just going to sit by and shrug our shoulders while the divorce rate becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as people begin to, and our young people begin to enter into the covenant of marriage with the expectation of a 50-50 chance? All right, yes, there are a lot of people in this congregation even that have gone through divorce, and it's awful, and it's painful, and it's so hard, and we will be there for you when you go through that kind of thing. But are we going to sit by idly and just allow people to believe that it's a 50-50 chance? Absolutely not. There's so much more that we can do to tear down that giant. That's a whole other sermon. Here's another communal giant that we struggle with. More and more, people are giving up the idea of a Sabbath. The idea of taking a day off for rest. They just don't have time for it. I see it mostly with our young people, with our youth. I hear constantly, well, kids are just busier than they used to be. I'll say it again, baloney. Okay, yes, kids are busy. We're all busy. Okay, but does that mean that we give up on the idea? Does that mean that God has to be the first thing that comes off our schedule when life gets busy? The idea of taking a day for rest and for worship, it's not a polite suggestion. It's a commandment from God. And it's not even one of those like secret commandments that's hidden in the back of Leviticus, right? No, it's one of the 10 commandments. It's God's way of saying, humans, you need a break. You need to take your rest. Your mind needs rest. Your body needs rest. Your soul needs revitalizing. Now, I'm not going to get legalistic about it. This isn't about Sundays. This is about the fact that in your rhythm, if you've got 7 days of work, you're messing it up. You've got to take a Sabbath in there somewhere. You need rest. America is like pulling away from God, and they're filling their Sundays, that extra day of the weekend, they're filling it up with work and crazy schedules. And they're exhausted. And I mean, are we just going to stand by as the church and watch our culture implode from exhaustion? Of course not. Let's tear down that giant. What's another one? Alcohol and sex. There's one nobody likes to talk about. People look at their children getting absolutely trashed and making just terrible choices in sex and love. And you just say things like, wow, that's what you do in college. It's a wild time of life. And so a description of what a few people do has become a statement of fact, a giant that we have let stand over us for far so long that it has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is what they say, so now this is what the kids are expecting when they get to college, but I'm here to tell you, baloney. There is a better way. There's a better way to raise our kids. I say we tear down that giant. All right, I'm not delusional, okay? I know that we're not going to change things tomorrow, right? I promise. I'm not crazy. I know that we're not going to stop teen drinking and pregnancy by next week, right? We're not going to get rid of Sunday morning sports practices by the next service. I know that. We're not going to fix the divorce rate by the time we have our next wedding. But ignoring this stuff doesn't help either. Those giants are there, and we need to do something about them, and I have no intention of leaving them there. We need to tear down those giants, identify the impossible, recognize how big the giants are, admit your struggles, and then face your giants. One more thing. Some giants will not come crumbling down instantly. All right, no matter what stones you throw at, some giants are so big they need to be systematically torn apart. It takes a lot more time. It can be frustrating, but the truth is lasting, sustainable change takes time. It takes hard work to beat some of these things. We're taking baby steps, but baby steps are still steps forward. In 2006, Tom Boyle Jr. lifted a Camaro off of a cyclist who was trapped. The lifting power required was 3,000 pounds, which is calculated to be over 3 times the maximum weight that his muscles and bones could take. It was impossible. And the website that I was reading this story from, because it's kind of an older story, it concluded that the story had been misrepresented. They concluded that if it's impossible, they must have exaggerated. Something must not be true. Maybe the car was on an incline or it was balanced in such a way that it wasn't that much to lift. And maybe some of those stories are exaggerated, but if you ever Google adrenaline stories, right? Adrenaline stories in the news, there's so many of them. And I was scrolling through these stories, and I just saw time after time of individuals doing impossible things. A mom lifting a car off her son. A police officer lifted a truck out of the mud off of a baby. A woman lifted a motorized garage door off of a puppy. I actually knew that one. That was a friend of mine. A man lifted a crashed helicopter off of his friend. The list goes on and on, but somewhere in there, I believe the impossible happened. And that gives me hope for the giants of our lives. We all have our personal giants. We all have our communal giants. And there's a reason we call them giants. They're big. They're scary. They're intimidating. So I just want to leave you with this. May you remember that God fights for us, that the battle is the Lord's. Our lives are God's battle. Because if we believe that, that's the moment that trust is born. And once we have trust, once trust has been born, confidence is renewed. And then we can face our giants. Amen.